My name is Christopher Parker. I'm a psychologist in New Jersey. I've been a psychologist since 2007. Before that, I worked for about 10 years in Manhattan. That's New York City for those of you outside the metropolitan area, and taught at a couple of universities and the Greenwich Institute for Psychoanalytic Studies. So I've been doing this for a while. I wanted to come on to do a podcast to start spreading some information, and the name of this show is Holding Space. And what holding space is, it refers to the act of being fully present with someone else without any judgment or distractions. It's being able to be fully engaged and be there. So I'm here for you, and hopefully you're here for me, and we are holding space for each other. Subject for today, and I wanted to do a series about this because it's something that is definitely on a lot of people's minds, is trauma. Trauma is used in multiple ways. Most of the time when people talk about trauma, they're referring to something horrible that's happened. A bus hit them. They were in a bus that hit something else, a tornado, natural disasters, personal disasters. They can also be a result of physical abuse, psychological abuse, which we will be talking about again at some point, because that is also a topic that is very on people's minds these days. But we want to focus on the more verb form of trauma, which is trauma as an emotional, psychological, and physical response that results from experiencing a distressing event. So the trauma inside you is different than the act of something traumatizing you. Trauma is something that a great many people have to cope with, and it's often a result of something active that happens. Sometimes it's a result of neglect. We're going to talk about complex trauma next time, but just to give you a bit of a foreshadowing, that is one thing that happens with trauma, is that you can be neglected, and you can not get a clear perception of how the world works. And that creates a sort of trauma also. There's so many different types of trauma, and there are so many different responses within your body and within your mind. And the end result of all this is that you develop sometimes a disorder, and you can be triggered. All these words will be explained at some point in greater depth, but I'm sure you've heard most of them at some point. And when you're triggered, you experience the trauma all over again. And sometimes it springs back as though it's actually happening again. This is why one of the things that I practice is EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It has to do with, it was originally done as a result of like following a moving finger, following a moving light. Now we use electronic tappers that you hold in your hand that buzz back and forth, but it uses bilateral stimulation to try to engage all the areas of your brain. And trauma can exist in just one area. It can exist in just like the amygdala, it can exist in the temporal lobe, but it exists as a memory, and it exists as a three-dimensional, fully formed memory. And again, when we get to the part about how to do therapy with trauma, this will be one of the topics that we cover. So moving on with what trauma is, there's two types, two categories. There's acute trauma, which results from a single incident. This is the proverbial, I was just in a tornado for the first time in my life. There's also chronic trauma, which results from repeated and prolonged exposure to a highly stressful event or events or person. How trauma affects the brain. Trauma impacts brain function, particularly in areas like the amygdala, which is the seat of emotion, and it processes emotions and engages the prefrontal cortex also, which is the area that controls executive function. You don't need to remember all this. There's not going to be a quiz at the end, but it is kind of interesting to see that there are certain neurological factors that are involved. It is not just something that you remember. It's something that gets locked in. And the amygdala is pretty much a one-way street, chemically speaking. When that neuronal squirt happens that results from emotions, it is a one-way street. It goes into your brain, and then your brain has to process it. And that's when the prefrontal cortex and the whole cortex becomes involved in sort of like figuring out what's going on with emotions. It's said that an actual emotional response, that squirt of neurotransmitter, only lasts about 90 seconds. And what happens after that is the thoughts that come as a result of it. You have the squirt of emotion, and then you have the thoughts that happen. You replay it. You replay the memory. You replay the thoughts that you have in relation to the memory. You replay the feelings that you have about yourself in relation to the memory. So in addition to the feeling itself, then you also have the response. So common indicators, you may have a range of symptoms, including intrusive thoughts or memories, mood swings, avoidance or reminders of the trauma, changes in sleep or appetite, and then there are the flashbacks and those things that we more commonly associate with post-traumatic stress disorder, which we will also cover in a future broadcast. For now, we want to focus on what constitutes an actual trauma. An event can be anything from a natural disaster, as I mentioned. It can also be a result of domestic violence, partner violence. It can be a result of someone who is chronically mean to you. So it can be a result of bullying. It can be a result of being neglected. And this is something that frequently happens with children of parents who are otherwise engaged, emotionally unavailable, unable to process the needs of their children. Your trauma is your trauma. And some people will say, that's nothing. Are you having a reaction to that? Just because it's not the worst thing that happened to someone else, it could be the worst thing that happened to you. It could be a very bad thing that happens to you that happens to somebody else all the time. They've learned to deal with it and they don't have any particular reaction. So when someone tells you that your trauma doesn't matter, yes, it does. If it matters to you, it matters. And that's what's most important. We have to remember that the things that we experience in our own minds are real, and they are just as real as any event that happens in the outside world. So your response to something can be totally different from someone else's. Comparing just really doesn't help. It hurts. I think it would be most beneficial for us to think about remembering that our trauma is our trauma. There's any number of cases of trauma that I work with now and that I've worked with over the years. Some people have very, very strong reactions, almost to the point of having a different part of themselves respond. It feels almost like you're dealing with a different personality. There's different types of therapy. We'll talk a little about internal family systems. But for now, let's just remember that your trauma is your trauma. Your response is your response. I hope that I eventually am going to give out my email address, and if people have questions about these things as they go along, and if there's directions that you want to provide about things that you want to see happen in the result of these podcasts, please communicate with me and let me know what you want to see, what you want to hear about, and I'll be glad to do more. The importance of acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of trauma is crucial for healing. Denying or minimizing its effects can lead to long-term psychological issues. Creating a supportive environment can help people feel safe and understood. Having someone who can be responsive to what's going on inside you is critical. Frequently, we see that people don't want to talk about it. This is something that's internal. You'll hear people say things like, oh, I must be crazy for feeling this way. Or, why did I respond this way to it? That's too extreme. Sometimes they enter an altered state in which they respond as though they are still at the age at which the trauma occurred. So you will see people who will regress to childhood. Freud talked about retreating to the last strong point of our ego. I'm sorry, I will quote Freud from time to time here. Think of whatever you want with that, but it's part of the way I learned to work. You respond, and you respond from your last strong point, which may very well be 3 years old, may very well be 5 years old. Sometimes people even respond in a childlike voice. Victims of sexual abuse often, especially if it happened in childhood, will respond as children when they are triggered, and they will respond with sometimes a childlike voice that will respond like with childlike behavior. The trauma is real and it's back. And so when that trigger happens, sometimes it's very alienating to other people who are around them. They don't feel understood. And they're probably not understood because all of a sudden you're dealing with somebody else. You're dealing with somebody else who's experiencing an internal event. That's why therapy is so important. And we'll cover different types of therapy as we go along. But for the initial episode here, we just want to focus on what actually happens. Your response is your response. And the options for healing involve therapy. They involve having a supportive other. But they also, more than anything else, involve being able to state your trauma. And that's, again, where holding space comes in handy. You need to be able to talk to someone. You need to be able to explain where you are. You need to be able to explain what happened. You need to be able to grasp what happened. And sometimes that requires more support than the average person can give, which is why a therapist would come in handy at that point. But more than anything else, you need to be able to articulate what's going on. Not just the event that happened, but the events that are happening inside your mind and result of experiencing that again. So this is a basic introduction to what trauma is. This is a series. We're going to talk about a number of types of trauma. We're going to talk about therapies for trauma. We're going to talk about things that can impact therapy, things that can facilitate therapy, and things that can hinder therapy. Because I am a therapist, this is what we do. And also because you need to know what to look for. We have a variety of people. I work for Discovery Psychotherapy Center, or rather I own and work for Discovery Psychotherapy Center here in New Jersey. And we do have some people who approach and they have experienced trauma, are experiencing trauma. And we need to be able to know what to do with people who are approaching with this particular issue. But we also want to educate people on what is going on so that you have some idea of why this is happening to you. In summary, trauma is a complex and multifaceted experience that can have lasting effects on individuals. By understanding trauma and its impacts, we can better support ourselves and others on the path to healing. We are aiming for greater understanding, we're aiming for greater compassion, we're aiming for a sense of shared experience. And I'll be glad to guide you through those. The next topic in the series is probably going to be complex trauma, which is a little more complex, hence the name, and deserving of its own episode. And at that point, then we will move on to therapy. We will move on to issues that you may present to me. You will see the email address at the bottom so that you can write and suggest topics or have questions that I can answer. Essentially, it's going to be one of those things that I would like your input on. So please feel free to give us a shout. Thank you for joining us, and I will see you next time.